Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon. I'm Jacob Kurtzer, Interim Director and Senior Fellow with the CSIS Humanitarian Agenda. On behalf of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. For nearly 20 years, in response to the attacks of September 11th, the United States has launched extensive combat operations and developed a multitude of legal mechanisms by which to combat and counteract the capacity of terrorist organizations and individuals. On the military side, the United States has been actively engaged in both conventional combat operations, counterterrorism operations, and military activities in which those lines are increasingly blurred. These engagements range from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to small-scale deployments across Africa, Southeast Asia, and beyond. In conjunction with the military activities, the United States, along with virtually all states and multilateral bodies, up to and including the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council, have developed a multitude of legal and regulatory frameworks, agreements, and restrictions as part of this broader effort to reduce the capacity of terrorist organizations to plan, finance, and carry out attacks. At the heart of it, the military activities and the regulatory apparatus are rooted in an expanded understanding and definition of what terrorism is and who is a terrorist. And while terrorism has legally defined characteristics, oftentimes it appears that the label is applied using the Justice Stewart framework of "we know it when we see it." In the United States, much of the challenge for humanitarian organizations can be tied to prohibitions on providing material support for terrorism in the form of training, service, advice, or personnel. The United States Supreme Court decision, Holder and Humanitarian Law Project, takes a broad view on what this means, challenging the ability of aid organizations to do essential foundational work. And the impact is felt not just in the humanitarian realm, but also in peace-building activities. Even more troublingly, nuisance lawsuits are being filed using other statutes, challenging aid organizations not just for work that they're doing today in contested areas, but also based on previous work in other contested areas. Other countries outside the United States have debated even more restrictive measures, up to criminalizing the mere presence in certain areas in control of a designated group. States are also using sanctions as mechanisms to prevent these so-called foreign terrorist organizations from accessing funding flows or materials that would assist in their operations. However, these unilateral and multilateral regulatory sanctions regimes have had the consequence, intended or not, of impeding the delivery of life-saving humanitarian assistance. While most sanctions designations include language intended to create humanitarian exemptions, these clauses often fail to carve out enough space for organizations to operate without real concern about legal liability. At best, these measures can place an expensive burden on aid groups as they spend staff time fulfilling extensive reporting requirements and have to hire legal counsel to navigate the licensing and waiver processes. At worst, sanctions and these other restrictive measures result in humanitarian agencies being forced to shut down. These issues have a real impact on aid organizations' ability to deliver in accordance with humanitarian principles, and the solutions need to be identified and enacted. So today, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists who will help us unpack some of these issues. We're very pleased and grateful to be joined by Dr. Fionnuala Ní Ealainn, who will be speaking with us. Dr. Ní Ealainn is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Concurrently, she is a University Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota and Professor of Law at the Queen's University of Belfast School of Law. We're also grateful to have Dr. Stephen Tankel here today. Dr. Tankel is an Adjunct Senior Fellow in the Asia Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security and Associate Professor at American University and a Senior Editor at War on the Rocks. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Before we begin, I want to remind our viewers that this session is designed to be interactive, so please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function, and we will try to get to them time permitting. I'd like to turn to you now, Fionnuala. You recently submitted a report that strongly resonates with humanitarian organizations who are constantly navigating the complexities of counterterrorism sanctions and license exemptions. Can you please share with us some of the key findings of your report and the recommendations?
Sure, and thank you to all for the invitation. Really glad to be here and joining CSIS. Maybe just to say briefly what prompted writing that report was the mandate that I hold, feeling really that the core legal regimes here, international humanitarian law in particular, are under extraordinary stress from counterterrorism regulation, that network of interwoven counterterrorism measures, Jake, that you described in the introduction. And the recognition that as these regimes are under stress, that in fact there's a real fundamental failure to ensure the protection of fundamental humanitarian principles that results in the impeding or delaying of humanitarian operations, and that ultimately, as well as affecting the sort of the neediest and the actors who protect them, that these ultimately stymie peacekeeping, peace building, peace enforcement efforts, the goals we all share of making these spaces better in the long run. So the recommendations are really primarily focused at international actors and in the multilateral space. The first is just the clear finding that current matrices, regulatory matrices, primarily Security Council resolution and Security Council action, does not permit humanitarian actors to carry out their mandates in a way that's consistent with international humanitarian law. And so that there's a fundamental compromise and an inconsistency with the obligations of the Council and states in their responsibilities to human rights and the dignity of the most vulnerable people. And from there, I think I am very clear that states are under an obligation to regulate in a way that gives precedence to the rules of international humanitarian law when they govern. And one of the big problems in this space has been the insidious creep of counterterrorism norms and practices and its encroachment on applicable IHL. The third recommendation is the clear responsibility for the Security Council and for other regional bodies to adopt humanitarian exemption clauses. These are not popular, I'm sure we'll talk about that, but these, in my view, unambiguously need to exempt humanitarian actions from counterterrorism measures and grant immunity from CT and sanctions regime for individuals and organizations that are engaged in principal humanitarian action. The fourth recommendation is that we could draw on experience. We do actually do this in some places already. We see it in for example, Resolution 2397 of 2017 on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We see it on the Somalia resolutions, in which there have been specific exemptions in particular contexts that allow us essentially to demonstrate how it can be done. So I think those practices need to be elevated and repeated and entrenched in more consistent ways across multilateral practice. Fifth recommendation is about ensuring that licensing and authorization regimes are human rights compliant. And we could talk a little bit more in the Q&A about what that might look like. And finally, the obvious point is we need national level regulation. A good example is Switzerland just passed new CT law in the last couple of months. They built in a humanitarian exemption to that. And I think we need to be doing that work at the national level as well as the regional and multinational level, and reminding states of what the costs are when we fail to do it.
Thank you. Just a follow-up. I mean, you mentioned in your report details the need for these exemptions, to be able to provide aid without legal retribution, and you highlighted some of the examples. Can you unpack a little bit further the example from the Korea or the Somalia experience, and maybe speak a little bit? We know that we have a lot of representatives from humanitarian organizations watching today. How can advocates for humanitarian action work convince the legislatures, both at the state level and the member states at the Security Council, that these humanitarian exemptions are, number one, necessary, and two, how can they address the concerns that they might have about lending, creating an opportunity for support to fall into the hands of designated groups?
Sure. So I think those two examples, Korea and Somalia, illustrate the ways in which effective political dialogue about the value of exemptions. And for example, in the context of Somalia, this was in the context of a famine, and it was clear that exemptions were needed in order not to exacerbate the really fundamental and dire situation on the ground. But it's the translation of that kind of nuanced, sophisticated understanding in the particular context in which sanctions are being meted out, to understand what the value of that is going to be to a broader set of actors. And so how do we do that? Well, the first thing I think we need to do, and humanitarian actors are doing already, is to provide the evidence base to show that the assumptions that there's misuse is actually ill-founded as a matter of practice. And what tends to happen is we get a kind of a bad apple, bad day kind of whispering that characterizes the totality of an enormous effort of humanitarian intervention in multiple fragile conflict and post-conflict settings. And the demonstrating that that work is done in an impartial way, that it is done in a way that is not seeking to undo other desired political outcomes by states is really important. So we need a strong evidence base to show that there isn't misuse. That exists, but I think we need to make it louder and more coherent to states. The second is that I think it's a really important point that this sector, the humanitarian sector, needs to be more firmly engaged with. I have made that case really trenchantly in New York, that the global counterterrorism architecture is generally inhospitable to civil society, but that includes to key humanitarian actors. And we need more of those voices coming into those spaces on the sort of security and policy space to talk to states about what the experience on the ground looks like and how the importance of the work serves long-term security interests. Starving a population does not make that population more likely to cooperate with you, to make peace, to prevent violence in the long run. And so the understanding of the negative cycles that we're seeing, for that to become the dominant conversation with states, I think is particularly important. And that goes to, I think, the sort of other motif here, which is the need for humanitarian organizations, and I know they're doing this already, but to sell the benefits of the critical role that impartial humanitarian action plays in this space. That the benefits are not just salutary human rights or humanitarian norm affirmation, but they are about winning the hearts and minds of people on the ground. That they are also about creating the conditions conducive to long-term stability and peace. And that in the long term, short-term security considerations often do not take into account long-term security stabilization. And that's the game that we ought to be in the context of exemptions, which is understanding that the long-term need to secure and sustain the fundamental rights of these populations is in the long-term security interests of states. And I think that's an argument that's being made, but I think it needs to be made as loudly and as coherently and as effectively as possible.
Thanks. That's an argument I think that's made quite regularly in Washington, both by humanitarian actors, but I think by a large part of civil society. I'm really interested in the point you made about the inhospitability of the counterterrorism networks or entities, at least within the UN system, to that civil society engagement as an area to think about moving forward. But I want to turn to you now, Stephen. In addition to your very accomplished resume, you also recently completed a fellowship with the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And so I'm curious, both from your research, but also from your recent experience, how does Congress at least currently think about this interconnection between, or this intersection between, our counterterrorism interests and priorities and equities and humanitarian action? What is the trend of thinking in the US Congress now about counterterrorism, the past, the future, and how it intersects with this other priority?
I'm muted. There we go. Thank you so much for having me here, and it's great to share a panel again with Fionnuala. I had a pleasure of doing so before the apocalypse started, and I was able to travel out to University of Minnesota. So, I don't want to oversell how much, right, Congress as a body is really thinking about this intersection, that you're talking about. But I do want to note that I think there is, among pockets of members and certainly among congressional staff, right, recognition that that there have been certainly unintended consequences in terms of the ways in which our current counterterrorism architecture has been structured and our efforts have been undertaken. And there have been efforts, not necessarily specifically on this issue, but on a surrounding set of issues that I think point to that awareness. And I would just point to a couple that, again, are not, that don't necessarily directly implicate this issue, but exist within that larger context. One is the passage last year of the Global Fragility Act, or which, for those who are not familiar, requires the executive branch, and the president has made the State Department the lead, to identify a small number of pilot countries or regions where the United States will attempt to address the underlying drivers, factors for fragility. And these will be both countries that have experienced conflict and need to be stabilized, but also to select countries or regions where there are potential indicators of conflict. And so we sort of have prevention countries and stabilization countries. This comes out of the very work that was done by USIP and the Task Force on State Fragility, which itself was authorized and funded by Congress, because there was this recognition that the approach that we were taking more broadly doesn't necessarily work. And there is very definitely in there, I think, a recognition of the importance of including civil society, of creating space for civil society in terms of how planning is done and how implementation occurs. And so again, even though this doesn't necessarily get to how to ensure that NGOs and civil society organizations aren't impacted by sanctions regimes, very much in that same vein of thinking. I would also point to a series of National Defense Authorization Act amendments. Last year, we don't yet know what's going to be in the NDAA this year, that dealt with civilian casualties in particular, and pushing the Department of Defense to try to improve its policies, not just for reducing civilian casualties, but also for working with NGOs and humanitarian organizations on identifying where those civilian casualties have occurred, on making payments, on making sure that people who were initially identified as members of terrorist organizations who turned out not to be are exculpated. So it's not just paying them, but also being clear that they are not members of these organizations. That all of this has led to, I think, larger conversations about how we, as the United States government, think about and identify who is and who is not a lawful target, in conflict, who is and is not a member of a terrorist organization. What does it mean to be implicated as such, right? Does it mean that your cousin can be bringing fruit to Shabab and you're with him one day and therefore you are now implicated, right, as a lawful target because you're a member of Shabab, right? To my mind, you shouldn't be, but where do we draw those lines? And so I think it's opened up some of those conversations. And all of this, we can talk a little bit more about this as we go forward, informed, what is now a larger effort in Congress. And again, we don't know because it's in the conference between House and Senate right now for the NDAA, which is an amendment to create a bipartisan national counterterrorism commission to look at U.S. counterterrorism policy and efforts almost 20 years after 9/11. That's obviously a much bigger set of issues than just what we're talking about here. I would say that the underlying impetus there is the recognition that A, we've learned a lot of lessons over the last 20 years that we should be putting to use. B, the threat has evolved considerably. C, we've had a number of unintended consequences. And D, counterterrorism is going to be less of a priority, most likely going forward. I mean, if current trends continue. And so as we are thinking about how to rebalance our overall level of effort, and then how do we actually rebalance those efforts themselves in terms of which threats to focus on, but also which instruments to use. I think there too, this is again informed by and will inform, those types of conversations about where does civil society factor in, how do we make sure that human rights and humanitarian organizations are heard, and how do we rethink, if we have to rethink, some of the legal and policy frameworks that are currently in place.
Thanks, Stephen. I have like a lot of questions from that introduction. I want to put two to you that are kind of in different streams, and we can sort of take them. We had at CSIS hosted last year, we call it Task Force on Humanitarian Access, co-chaired by Senators Young and Booker. And this narrative that you raised came up, which is we're moving away from a counterterrorism lens and towards one of great power competition. And as the focus shifts away, I mean, one of the concerns I think people might have is, well, right now, for better or for worse, there aren't a lot of wins, right, for the humanitarian community, but there is a lot of conversation about things like civilian casualties, about things like the impact of counterterrorism regulations on humanitarian action. Is there at all a concern here that as the focus shifts to China or to some other narrative, that the counterterrorism conversation actually gets shunted aside, and we lose the ability to have this kind of high-level dialogue?
I think that depends on how the conversation is shaped, which is one of the reasons, why there was this push for a commission, was to help, I think, shape that conversation in a way that ensures those issues aren't shunted aside. As a person who's worked on counterterrorism issues for some time, right, I am not one who advocates for an end to CT, but I'm also not one who is advocating that we should continue to be doing counterterrorism at exactly the same level and in exactly the same way, right? If the trend seems to be that we're going to be doing less of this, then the question then becomes, how do we downshift? And how do we downshift in a way that both mitigates threats to the United States, because that is going to be a concern, but also in a way that ensures that our ongoing efforts are as closely aligned as possible with what we're going to be doing in the strategic competition space. And I would argue that when it comes to strategic competition, that one of the things the United States has I think, to be understated, done a poor job of doing, at least over the last 4 years, has been to lead with our values and our principles. This is in many ways a competition over governance, with authoritarian actors. And so civil society, human rights organizations, humanitarian organizations, they should all be right on the front lines as important allies and partners. And so, so I think, insofar as we want to make sure our CT efforts are as aligned as possible with our strategic competition efforts, that keeps that conversation going. The other thing that I would just point to is that we are probably going to rely more on our partners, and we have been for some time. And here I would highlight again, it's sort of to use a baseball term, it's sort of small ball, but I think it nevertheless is important. Some of the amendments to last year's NDAA that expanded, some of those policies I was talking about with civilian casualties to partner nations as well, to some of the oversight that's being done on use of force to our partners as well, right? Trying to recognize that our partners' actions are our own in some ways in terms of how they are interpreted, even if we are not responsible for what our partners are doing. And so there, I think there's also an opportunity to continue to have that conversation.
I appreciate the baseball analogy. I grew up in a baseball home where we're like small ball people. And I think
I look, as a Yankees fan, I see the Washington Nats hat behind you, and I congratulate you, and I won't hold it against you. So
I think for people who understand how the US system works, small ball makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, this is, and something you just touched on, I want to turn back to you, Fionnuala, the role of partners. We did a report earlier this year in our program where we went to, we didn't go up to the Northeast, but we went to Nigeria. We looked at the way that the Nigerian government and the United States is tackling the humanitarian challenges in Northeast Nigeria. And what we saw there, and we've seen in many other countries around the world, is language by the Nigerian government that looks a lot like the way in which the United States speaks about counterterrorism, the criminalization of large groups of people, the designation, the prohibitions against engaging with people. So, Fionnuala, turning to you from your seat in Minnesota, but in New York, can you talk a little bit about, the United States has regularly used sanctions and other tools, as part of these tactics to combat terrorism. How does the U.S. play a role in shaping those current trends? And then, one of the interesting things about the U.S. is, critics of U.S. humanitarian spending say the percentage is less, than the other countries spend as a percentage of GDP, but it's such an outsized contributor to humanitarian action. So how can the U.S., being the leader and a norm generator, sort of counterbalance some of the possibly negative trends that we've seen in terms of these restrictive measures?
Well, just to say at the kind of macro level, and coming from the great, well-known baseball nation of Ireland, I can't contribute on that particular score, but I can say a little bit about, just to Stephen's point about what the legacy of US action over 20 years has been. And I do want to say, I think this kind of moment of pause as we hit the 20-year anniversary of 9/11 is really important, not just as a domestic matter, lessons learned, things to be done, things to be recalibrated, but to understand the kind of architectures and influence that the US has had overseas. And not all of that, I think, from the perch I hold, has been positive. Many states have taken the permissive environment for regulating counterterrorism as license, in Jake's terms, to essentially regulate anyone who disagrees with them under the counterterrorism banner. One might think of recent legislation in Hong Kong or the Philippines as good examples of that kind of permissive environment in which all is possible, including massive restriction on humanitarian actor. So one of the dangers is as the US retreats, in some sense, recalibrates, the legacy of what it has left in terms of permissibility and structures sits in other parts of the globe in ways that may be profoundly counterproductive and in the long term, not in the long-term interests of the United States. Nigeria is perhaps a good example of this, Jake, where the recent events in Nigeria where we've bloated an unaccountable, non-transparent, highly corrupt security sector in the context of a fight against terrorism and not listened to local partners who've talked about the dangers and the human rights abuses of those same bodies. And so what can the US do? I think that this outsized role in shaping sanctions regimes, I mean, again, a number of commentators, and I include the states that the mandates talks to and engages with regularly, have said that what they see is a US addiction with sanctions as a kind of a one horse show, where that's the thing that just keeps getting rolled out, that it's become the go-to tool, and also often a very blunt tool, not a nuanced tool. So when you use the same tool over and over again, but it's not refined or balanced or reworked, the tool starts to lose its effectiveness. More than that, when that tool is used in the absence of using other tools to supplement and support the work that's done, which is both the sort of legitimacy piece, but the engagement in these sites where, why is the humanitarian action needed in the first place? It's largely needed because we're talking about fragile, complex, dysfunctional societies where various fundamentals are not working. And so it seems to me that this domestic recalibration is enormously important from the point of view of kind of really speaking to the capacity of the US to have a more sophisticated toolbox in engagement in a number of these sites, which serves US interests in the long run. And also, I think, to bear in mind that in many cases, states are taking their lead. The shape, as Jake said, the outsize effect of whether it's the budget or the kind of normative strength of the US's approach has this outsized effect on our allies, as well as those who are not our allies in this space. And I think that profoundly speaks to the need not only for recalibration, but understanding that the consequences are not just to us. The consequences are often embedded in other places where they are harder to undo because, frankly, there's less control over them, and they may not be in democratic sites where they can be easily dislodged.
Thanks. I mean, Steve, I want to know if you have any sort of reflections on that, but I also want to refer to some of your recent, publications and some of your earlier comments when we talked about, I think there's kind of this, in the same way that there's intended consequences and unintended consequences of our CT and sanctions policies, I think there's intentional, either mimicking or adopting of the United States' approaches, and there's unintended. And you referenced the small ball, this, the way that the U.S. can put in these provisions about, tracking civilian casualties and others. I know that you've written recently about our security sector assistance. And so you've written both about making our counterterrorism resource sustainable, but also about rethinking our security sector assistance. And one trend that I think, and it touches on something Fionnuala mentioned, which is about, the sometimes inhospitable nature of the dialogue between security actors and humanitarian actors. In my experience, both at CSIS and working in humanitarian organizations, I think there is a recognition of the military, at least in the United States, as being a very important vector by which to address some of these challenges. So, can you talk a little bit about what a reformed security sector, security assistance project would look like for the United States and its partners, and where within that, either within the U.S. defense apparatus currently or within that security dialogue with partners would be the appropriate places for humanitarian actors, for peace builders, for other advocates about these issues to engage to have maximum impact?
It again. Let me just very, very briefly to Fionnuala's points. I would certainly agree that I think one of the negative externalities, has been this opening of the door for other countries to label civil society organizations that honestly, in some cases, should be on the front lines, right, doing CVE as terrorist organizations themselves. And I think, again, it would be an understatement to say we have not seen a lot of pushback on that over the last 4 years, but that's something that I think has gained pace over the last 4 years, but it didn't start 4 years ago. And that is going to be an issue. To my earlier point, that I think it becomes actually even more important when we talk about strategic competition in which governance, rule of law, anti-corruption efforts, and the like all play a really absolutely critical role. And I would also note, that to the degree to which there is an opportunity on the access for humanitarian organizations in particular, I would reinforce Fionnuala's points that that it's important to be evidence-based, that the costs of allowing this are not that great. I would also add that the costs of not doing it can sometimes be high, right? If these organizations are important for de-radicalization or counter-radicalization efforts, or if they are important for helping to bring ends to conflicts that fuel violence. And I think there is again, while we might not get a universal exemption, that there's space again to take that small ball analogy a little bit further, and that's a sort of a next step to try to explore. Now, on your security sector reform is such a broad topic, and the piece that you kindly mentioned, was like I wrote with Tommy Ross, who was the former DASD for Security Cooperation at DoD, and it was like like a whopping 5,000 words. So I won't try to summarize everything here. I'll note, I think, for the purposes of this conversation, that several things that we highlighted. One was the importance of a more rigorous planning process, both at state and DoD, that factors in earlier on in the assessment phase, the way in which this may implicate civil military relations in another country, political dynamics, security dynamics, affect civil society or other organizations, that all of this needs to be considered more upfront, right? Simply doing Leahy vetting on the back end where we decide, okay, we're not going to give arms or weapons to you because, you popped for, gross violations of human rights. Actually, no, we need to be much more forward thinking up front in terms of how we do assessments for this. That's number one. Number two, right, a recommendation that we make that is hardly novel, but the importance of focusing more on civilian instruments, both in the security sector, and then marrying that to other instruments of statecraft as well. And this was very much informed by the need that we saw also to transition a lot of our security assistance and cooperation efforts away from counterterrorism. Not to say that we're done with that, but that in an era of strategic competition, the assistance we're providing and the actors to whom we're providing it needs to change, right? A lot of the areas where the United States is going to be competing with Russia and China are not going to be necessarily in the military domain. And so, right, the military still has a really important role to play, but arguably, civilian actors are going to be are as if not more important. And then we struggled with what does the United States do in terms of providing assistance or selling arms to countries that are that are problematic. I quite frankly think it is unrealistic to say that the United States as a blanket is never going to sell to and to identify X number of countries and say they're never going to do it, right? I mean, we have a small number of countries that we don't sell to. But beyond that, I do think that there could be a lot more done up front to identify what those red lines would be, to communicate that to partners, and then to hold ourselves to the conditions that we set in those areas.
Thanks. I think there's a lot. I know there's a lot of frustration in DC now because I think people have, you look at the arms sales with respect to the Yemen war, and I think advocates have done such good work making the case. Congress has actually done its job in this particular case, and we still don't see the change we need to see. I want to turn back to Fionnuala briefly. Stephen mentioned we're not going to see blanket exemptions.
I should be clear. I'd love. I don't think that that's likely.
And that reflects my own conversation and the conversations of my colleagues in this sector. But we do have a question from the audience here from Sai Venkatesh, who talks about, we discussed. I'm going to summarize, Sal. How the proliferation of this language, not just from the United States and European countries to the Security Council, but at the domestic level, and the challenge is that every country has its own wording and its own definitions and so on and so forth. So getting away from a universal exemption, is uniform recommended language feasible? Is there a template out there that can be provided to states? We're catching up, but as states come to the recognition that there's a need for this kind of exemption language, rather than going place to place and having to navigate, is there a template that advocates can look at and say, well, here's the example? Have you?
Yeah, my mandate, I suppose we engage country by country. So in the last couple of months, we've been engaged in the Philippines and in Switzerland as two key examples of countries, and have both critiqued language and offered language. So we could certainly share the mandate's website has those communications. And so that's an attempt by one entity within the UN system to provide that kind of human rights, international humanitarian law compliant language. I do think there are places, I agree with John, we have to make the case for the principled case consistent with international humanitarian law for exemptions, which is really what the law requires at an optimized level. But we also, it's like you have to do two contradictory things at the same time. You also then have to argue for the sort of small ball, piecemeal things. That includes better sort of understanding of regulatory frameworks as they exist across systems. So that's like a research, that's both a research and clarifying task. It's also about really tracking the effectiveness of exceptions and derogations. So showing the evidence base for when you have those exceptions that they do what they do and you benchmark them really well. And it's also about encouraging like greater recourse. I mean, the mandate's view is that there's, as a legal matter, exemptions are a problem in terms of the sort of consistency with international humanitarian law, because they presume that you have to ask for something that the law actually creates an entitlement to. But nonetheless, it does seem to me that we still have to encourage greater recourse to those exemptions on a country by country basis. And we also, I think, have to be better at explaining to NGOs, civil society, humanitarian actors from government how to use them. Because even when they exist in ways that are often highly inaccessible to the actors who need them the most and who need to be able to have them work effectively. So even when they often exist, they exist in such a myriad of procedural sort of nightmare that it's hard to access them. And maybe finally also to say here, we've mostly talked about governments, but I think we have to have a really significant conversation with the banking sector, because that's actually where the rubber hits the road on a lot of this, where in fact, private actors who are risk averse, who actually over-regulate for fear of the consequences to them in particular of being hit by negative state sanctions. So better engagement between the private, the state, and the NGO or civil society sector are all things that are actually graspable. These are not things that are impossible, and would in fact, I think, if we could have a commitments at those technocratic levels, we would then, I think, create the conditions conducive for the bigger discussion that I think we think is needed around wholesale exemptions.
You've effectively preempted our next audience question, which there's two coming both from friends of the program, Davi Brownick here and Joel from the Norwegian Refugee Council's USA office, talking about this bank de-risking challenge and the nature of the private sector. So I want to pick up on that piece. In our conversations and at the UN level, we've talked about the proliferation of counterterrorism bodies. There's the UN Office of Counterterrorism and the Security Council's Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. And you've encouraged in your report engaging with civil society, including humanitarian actors. And I suppose we could take a broad view of civil society to include banks. There has recently been I want to get the wording right, sort of the permission for a study between CTED and OCHA, and I'm just curious. This seems to be a positive step, but many times over the past 20 years there have been positive developments that have had unintended consequences. So can you talk a little bit about that process and what you see are the benefits and potential pitfalls, and how to incorporate the private sector into that dialogue?
Sure. And maybe just to say, I will acknowledge this is a bigger conversation, but apropos Stephen's rule of unintended consequences, one of the post 9/11 unintended consequences is a gargantuan UN counterterrorism architecture that's threatened to dwarf the other pieces of the UN in a way that I think is an enormous problem to the balance of the architecture, and the danger that everything becomes CT-led, that we do development through CT, we do education and culture through CT. And that, I think, that securitization model will not serve us well nationally. It certainly doesn't serve us well internationally. But in relation to this sort of potential evidence gathering work that you've described, Jake, my concern there is the concern the mandate experienced when we engaged on our report to try to get evidence from many of the humanitarians working in the sector. And what we found, and I'm sure some of those listening in will attest to, is many humanitarians were willing to say to us off record what their practical, specific experience of particular kinds of barriers or challenges or harms in particular country settings, but none would go on record because they understood and had internalized that the cost of going on record to criticize the states who were providing the funds and the restrictions might be to further stymie their funds. So we're in a little bit of a negative loop here, and I don't quite know how we get past that. I think, you know, governments acknowledging that they want that information and that they will not sort of have penalties or reprisals against civil society organizations, including humanitarians, who tell them what the problem is, that they are not going to be negatively impacted by sharing that information, I think is a really important principle here. And I guess I would also say that it seems to me, you know, again, you know, there's a real challenge here when we see UNCT bodies essentially colonizing humanitarian space. And while there's a role for CT bodies to ensure that any body of international law, human rights, law of armed conflict, humanitarian law, or refugee law is enforced generally, we have to bear in mind that there's a key guardian of these principles in the ICRC. And it does concern me that we see UNCT bodies encroaching on, I think, what is the appropriate space of the appropriate international entity who has the preeminent role in ensuring compliance and engaging with states on this issue.
Thanks for that. We're starting to run towards the end. So I want to come back to you, Stephen, and get back to this legislation that's in conference now about the commission. We talked last week a little bit about, I think I said glibly, if you don't want to get something done, you call for a report. And what's interesting to me is there have been these baby steps, these bunts and sacrifice flies, so to speak, in the NDAA, and I think the Global Fragility Act is functionally the equivalent of a big step. But could you talk a little bit about the value of that commission? Because I think it also speaks to Fionnuala's point of that evidence base and that honest dialogue. And so could you talk a little bit about what you see as the value of the commission? And then, to the extent that you're comfortable, having worked as a advisor at DoD, having seen this from the Hill, and having now, you're sat outside of government, what is the best way to foster that honest, non-punitive dialogue that can get to that real evidence base, so that we can have the best policy going forward?
Sure, thanks. And note, I managed to finally not have to unmute myself this time.
We're all learning.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think, I'm certainly sympathetic to the concerns, I think, that come with a very large commission, that it can be, a year or a year and a half's worth of work that ends with a report that either people read and discard, or that people read and say, well, these are great ideas, but they don't actually get implemented. And so, I'm not sure that a commission is the only way to get at these issues, but I think, the thinking behind the commission at the time was that there needed to be some vehicle beyond the executive branch and legislative branch that could take a step back and look at these broader issues. Or rather, they didn't need to be, but there was benefit in having one. And that it would serve several purposes. One, it would provide evidence-based expert assessments on a range of these issues to inform an administration that wanted to make changes, if that administration wanted to make changes. The second is that it would potentially act as a forcing function for Congress on certain issues, especially the way in which the commission was designed. The idea that the commissioners and the executive staff director would have to go and brief all of the different committees of interest, and there was 6 or 7 in the House and Senate each that were going to be charged with selecting the commissioners, because counterterrorism is so cross-cutting. that this would be an opportunity to inform ongoing legislation, a way for people to feed into that commission through the committees themselves. There would also be public hearings, public comment period, so there would be an opportunity for humanitarian NGOs and everybody else to come and feed into this process. And there would be a forcing function then for for driving individual legislative proposals coming out of this, in addition to the overall report. On issues big and small, right? I mean, it would be impossible probably to have this commission without talking about the AOMF, for example, and so you'd get thinking that would come out of it. It's in conference right now. I don't know whether it makes it out of conference or not, right? I mean, hopefully it does. I'm heartened that I think this administration is thinking about a lot of these issues anyway, right? I think it's important to remember that the idea for this commission started, almost 18 months ago. So it was a very, very different world then. I think the incoming administration is thinking about a lot of these issues. So even if the commission doesn't happen, I think they still get, get a fair say. But I do think that there is value in having, experts with gravitas come together, step back, gather a lot of evidence, think hard about these issues, and in a bipartisan spirit come together and say, here's what we're prepared to recommend, as a bipartisan commission of experts, across this different range of issues. Especially when you're talking with something as fraught as how we potentially rebalance or rethink the responsiveness of our CT efforts and how we reduce some of those unintended consequences. But like I said, even if it doesn't come to fruition, I think it has helped generate a lot of important debates. And I think hopefully the legislation itself and those questions and debates will inform, where this incoming administration goes.
Great. Well, thank you for that. We're coming to the end, so let me just say, unless Fionnuala, if you have anything you want to respond to.
No, I just concur that it's the hallmark of a mature and thoughtful democracy that can do this work. So I sincerely hope, at least for the global community, that work happens in the United States, because it's an object lesson in how democracies ought to think about the way they do security. And I think that's a lesson that's important not only for the United States, but really important to be heard outside of the United States.
Thank you.
And thank you both. I mean, I think, for the viewers or listening audience, they used to say, I would strongly recommend, if we could do it technologically, direct people to, Fionnuala's report, but at minimum, the Just Security piece you wrote recently, and same for Stephen Tankell's recent piece on security sector assistance and rethinking it, because I think these are both important contributions and helping us think through some of these very vexing challenges. So thank you both for your time today. Thank you to our audience for joining us, and to my friends and former colleagues for contributing questions. And this event will be posted in its entirety on our website shortly after its conclusion. And we look forward to seeing you next time, hopefully with more chipper subject matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.